When Americans hear the phrase Sharia law, a lot of people imagine something terrifying. They imagine religious police, public executions, the overthrow of the US Constitution. But the reason that people imagine those things is because for many years now, politicians, pundits, and activists have deliberately used the phrase Sharia law as a fear trigger rather than explaining what it actually is. Hi, I'm Nate Charles, and welcome back to the Rule of Law Brief. So today I want to talk honestly about Sharia. What is it? What impact does it have on the lives of everyday Muslims? And how likely is it that Sharia is going to supplant other US law? So, first of all, the word Sharia literally translates from Arabic into English as the path or the way. In Islam, Sharia refers broadly to the moral and ethical framework that Muslims use to guide their lives. It's really not a single universal code of law. It's not a single book, and it's not remotely comparable to a unified legal system like the US Code or even English common law. In fact, there is no universally accepted list of rules that can even be identified as Sharia. There is no Islamic equivalent of a Congress publishing authoritative legal code for all Muslims everywhere. Even within Islam, there's significant disagreement about how Sharia should be interpreted, what specific rules fall under the umbrella of Sharia, and how those principles should be applied to daily life. These interpretations vary enormously across different schools of Islamic thought, different countries, different cultures, and different historical traditions. And if we're being honest, that reality makes the entire idea that Sharia could somehow become a coherent replacement for existing US law even less plausible. This thing that Americans see as some sort of a monolithic threat to US legal traditions is, in reality, an enormously broad and internally debated religious tradition. Moreover, for Muslims around the world, including American Muslims, Sharia primarily concerns personal religious practices. It doesn't really regulate externalities. Sharia is, for the most part, designed to regulate individual religious practices and, in some cases, practices between two or more individuals. Again, Sharia is very, very broad, but it covers things like the proper way to pray, the proper way to treat other members of your family, the proper way to conduct your business in an honorable way, practices related to personal finance and charity, rules on what obligations that individual Muslims owe to their communities at large, and just sort of generally how to become a better person before God. And that is what Sharia means in the daily lives of most Muslims. For Americans trying to understand Sharia through a Western religious lens, the closest rough analogy is probably something like canon law in Catholicism or other long-standing religious legal traditions. Both Sharia and canon law are frameworks of religious ethics, obligations, customs, and practices that believers voluntarily follow as part of their faith. Now, to be honest, the analogy isn't perfect. Canon law is governed through a centralized church hierarchy headed by the Vatican. Islam does not have a single centralized authority that speaks for all Muslims. Again, interpretations of Sharia vary widely across different cultures, countries, and even schools of Islamic thought. But also, Islam is not unique in having a complex religious legal tradition. Far from it. We've already mentioned canon law, but Judaism also has centuries of rabbinical legal interpretation preserved in texts like the Talmud. In many respects, those traditions are actually more textually defined and systemically preserved than Sharia, which remains highly decentralized and subject to enormous disagreement across the Muslim world about interpretation and application. And to be very clear, I'm not saying this is a criticism of Judaism. Not even close. Jews are fully entitled to live their lives according to their religious convictions, just like Christians, and hopefully, just like Muslims, are entitled to live according to theirs. That's what religious liberty means in a free society. The point here is that Americans already live very peacefully alongside religious traditions that contain extensive bodies of moral, ethical, and legal reasoning without assuming that those traditions are secretly plotting to overthrow the US Constitution. The principles that allow Americans to peacefully coexist with canon law and the Talmud should also apply to Muslims. And before every Islamophobic idiot on the internet starts pointing to Saudi Arabia, yes, there are governments in the world that impose harsh or authoritarian interpretations of Islamic law. Just like there have been governments throughout history that impose harsh versions of Christianity, Judaism, and even secular political ideology. A point that I think most of us would be able to agree upon is that human beings are capable of weaponizing literally any belief system. But it is critically important to understand that authoritarian governments in places like Iran, Taliban-controlled Afghanistan, or Saudi Arabia do not represent all Muslims any more than the Spanish Inquisition represented all Christians, or any more than white supremacist churches throughout the United States represent Christianity. There are nearly 2 billion Muslims on Earth, spread across dozens of cultures, languages, ethnicities, and various political systems. There is no single universal interpretation of Sharia. And frankly, the vast majority of the fear surrounding Sharia in the United States has been fueled by deeply misleading statistics and politically motivated advocacy campaigns designed to get votes, even at the expense of the well being of the community. For example, anti Muslim advocates have repeatedly circulated survey data claiming that enormous percentages of American Muslims want to impose Sharia law in the United States. But when you actually examine the wording of those surveys, the claims fall apart immediately. One critique discussed a Heritage Foundation survey that claimed that 39% of Muslims supported the implementation of Sharia law in the United States. But the term implementation was never defined, and probably on purpose. Because if you ask a Muslim whether they support implementing Sharia in their own life, many of them will reasonably interpret that to mean praying regularly, giving generously to charity, following dietary rules, and living according to general Islamic ethics. That is a radically different proposition from asking whether they support replacing the US Constitution with a theocracy. And in fact, the Heritage Foundation survey data has largely been refuted by better design surveys asking whether religion should become a source of American law. Those surveys revealed dramatically lower numbers. And that disparity in the data shouldn't surprise anybody. Because if you asked many Christians whether they wanted biblical morality implemented in America, a lot of them would say yes. And by that, they mean things like being kinder, helping the poor, strengthening families, or encouraging honesty in everyday dealings. That doesn't necessarily mean creating a Christian theocracy. Although, to be fair, we're seeing an increasing number of people who legitimately are calling for the establishment of a Christian theocracy. But at any rate, these linguistic ambiguities are intentional. There are many organizations right now who will benefit politically and financially from convincing Americans that Muslims are secretly plotting to overthrow the US Constitution. Fear mobilizes voters, fear drives donations, and fear creates outrage content that is incredibly viral on social media. But fear is ultimately based in ignorance, and ignorance is the opposite of truth. So let me make it absolutely clear here. American Muslims are not trying to replace the US Constitution. In fact, the US Constitution already protects their right to practice their religion peacefully in the same way that it prevents the United States from adopting Islam as an official religion, because the US Constitution does not allow the establishment of official religion, period. All of this is in the First Amendment. We already accommodate religious practices in countless ways for many, many different faiths. Orthodox Jewish communities sometimes use religious arbitration in private disputes. Catholics follow canon law internally within their church. Christians refuse certain medical procedures based on conscience. Amish communities structure their lives around religious principles. And I should know this, I grew up in Lebanon County, Pennsylvania. Religious dietary practices are protected. Religious dress is protected. That is not America being overrun by a theocracy. That is Americans practicing their tenets of their religion according to the dictates of their conscience, which is protected by the First Amendment. And Muslims are entitled to the exact same constitutional protections as everyone else. At the end of the day, no religious belief overrides American law. And that fact is one of the major contributors to the other fact that American religious practices, regardless of faith, are broadly protected. That is how constitutional law works, and the Constitution reigns supreme, always. And the vast majority of American Muslims understand and accept that, just the way the vast majority of Christians in America understand and accept that. Most Muslims in society are doing exactly what everybody else is doing: raising families, working jobs, starting businesses, going to school, trying to build stable lives, and practicing their faith peacefully in accordance with the dictates of their conscience. The fear surrounding Sharia law in America has been manufactured by people who politically benefit from keeping Americans suspicious of one another and who benefit from keeping Americans stupid. Don't give in to them. They are only doing it because fear mobilizes voters, fear drives clicks, and fear creates outrage. But fear will never create understanding. And if we're serious about being a free society, a genuinely free society, then religious liberty cannot only be applied to religions we personally understand or agree with. That has to apply to everybody, including Muslims.